Hello and welcome to the latest episode of DEI-logue, conversations on diversity, equity and inclusion, part of the Human Capital Insights podcast channel here at the Conference Board. This series consists of conversations with experts and thought leaders who are going to be speaking at our Diversity and Inclusion Conference coming up in May. The last episode we had was with Brian Lee of Salesforce, talking about his own experience around Asian racism, anti-Asian racism. And I thought it'd be a good idea to follow that up with a more broader discussion about hate crime, because there's certainly been, I think, well-documented increasing frequency of hate crimes in North America. And so delighted that one of our speakers from the event can join us today. I'm joined by Peter McBride, who's the director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at King College. So thank you for joining us, Peter.
It's my pleasure, John. I'm really delighted to be here.
So I think maybe just to first sort of establish, we're not going to have this is not sort of a legal discussion of how the law, the legal system defines hate crime, but rather a more broadly sort of moral and historical exploration of hate crimes. So perhaps we can begin, if you can just share a little bit about your own biography and your own work, where
Sure.
that sort of touched the issue of hate crimes.
Sure. So maybe you can tell from my accent, but I'm not a native of North America. I come from Northern Ireland, and actually only moved here to the States back in August, September of last year. So I have spent most of my life, I'm in my late 50s now, and I spent most of my life working in Northern Ireland in a variety of capacities, but all of them had to do with supporting people, particularly around mental health issues. And as time went on, the explicit context of that being operating in a conflict society and then in a post-conflict society. So my work has always, while it has been in largely in mental health and bereavement work, I have always viewed it through the lens of the context of the Troubles, which means that the impact of trauma, the impact that has on communities and individuals, is one of the lenses through which I interpret people's behavior and their relationships with one another. It's also important to say I started my career as a clergyman. Back in Northern Ireland, that was, that kind of forced me into one side of the conflict because I was on, obviously there is a religious component to it. So I do have experience of being strongly identified by other people, not necessarily doing it myself, but strongly identified by other people as being one side of a violent divide, and that had a profound effect actually in my later career, where I think a lot of my motivation was to prove people wrong, to prove to people that I was not actually on one side of this, but had the capacity to be neutral and independent, and just wanting to help people find solutions and reconciliation.
And obviously, in your current role, being the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, I mean, that's the sort of the most horrific hate crime that we can identify, right?
Yeah. So that's the link. So my reason for being here is the work that I've done on trauma and the experience for communities of trauma, and how that experience is actually a risk factor. So communities that have experienced violence and trauma are themselves likely to repeat that violence as a consequence. And I believe that's because of the mechanisms by which trauma affects their behaviors and the way they see the world. And I think what's going on in Northern Ireland at the minute, I'm happy to talk about later on, but it is, I think, evidence of that sort of unresolved conflict that has been bubbling around in the background for the last 20 odd years.
Yeah. I think just briefly, in a nutshell, and this is a horrible question, but if you just, the Troubles. I mean, I'm of an age where it was in the news all the time, but I was on the other side of the, I was obviously raised in England. Just briefly, what were the Troubles? Because I know for a lot of younger folk, they may not figure in their education.
Sure. So at one level, the Troubles started, it's a euphemism to call them the Troubles. This was a violent civil conflict that many people died. There about 4,000 people lost their lives as a consequence of this civic violence as part of in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. And it's that statement that is the core kind of challenge with this. So people think that the conflict in Northern Ireland is a religious conflict. It isn't. The religion is a sort of veneer on top of something much more profound, which is about people. There are two ethnic identities. There's one ethnic identity or ethnicity which is very strongly identified with being Irish, being the Republic of Ireland, the island of Ireland. People see their roots, their identity, their nationality as Irish. And then there's another component in society of about an equal size in Northern Ireland who choose to identify themselves as British and will reinforce the British ethnicity in terms of their presence in Northern Ireland. This erupted into violence in the late 60s. And it became, the paramilitary groups that became involved in this, one on the Republican side, the Irish side, it was the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. On the British side, it was Unionist paramilitaries like the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, or the Ulster Defence Association, UDA. In the late 60s and 70s, what really increased and escalated the violence was the introduction of British troops onto the streets of Northern Ireland. The British troops were there until the 90s. And when you start to use a sort of a military force in a civil setting, it sort of lends itself to trouble. So for 40 years, there was indiscriminate violence, shootings, bombings. Some of it hit the UK. So, the famous bombing of the Conservative Party conference in Brighton. There was bombing in Canary Wharf. It all came to a head in the 90s with what's known as the Good Friday Agreement, which is probably a globally recognized peace process and treaty that brought peace to Northern Ireland and settled the issue of ethnicity. So I can sit here, if I got my wallet out, I could have two hands. In one hand, I could have my Irish passport, and in the other hand, I would have my British passport. I am allowed to be either Irish or British or both.
Okay.
And that is the compromise. And that's what we've been living with for the last 20 years as a platform to create peace.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned there that role that the sort of the presence of military on the streets. And of course, I think one of the things that's certainly come up in discussion here in the US in the last year is the sort of militarization of the police force in terms of the US. So perhaps we can begin then, move then to sort of just how do you define hate crime, given your own experience in Northern Ireland, your current role and everything that's gone on in between.
Yeah. So I understand hate crime to be actions that are taken that are motivated by not by necessarily what someone has done, but by who they are. So hate crimes for me is violence, and it's usually violence against individuals or groups as a consequence of their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their religious views, the color of their skin, any of these things where a factor that over which they have no control becomes the focus and justification for violence. So hate crimes for me are that's all in the title. It's motivated by hate, but it is by its nature generalized. So they tend to be categories of people, people who are homosexuals, people who are black, people who are Catholics, people who are Protestants. They tend to be these kind of broad generalizations, and individual or groups decide that they are a threat and that there is a sense of permissibility about persecuting them and being violent towards them.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is obviously crime that's violence that's directed at people by virtue of what they are rather than what they do. One of the things that came out of our discussion with Brian in the last episode is the increase in anti-Asian hate crime coincides with this notion of the China virus, right? Kung flu and all those kinds of that kind of rhetoric. But it's clearly not the case or it seems to me clear it's not the case. There's a cause and effect there. Currently, the US cases are starting to be dominated by the UK virus, and you and I are both, as you mentioned, you're UK and Irish. I'm from the UK. Well, I don't think either of us are anticipating an uptick in anti-British violence. The hate is there, isn't it? And then there's something happens that it becomes a vector, becomes an excuse. I mean, is that the sort of process?
It is. So I think it's a multi-factor process, and I think it has deep roots, and the roots go into the nature of social relationships. I think, and the sense in which we as human beings. So if we go right into the sense of what is it that makes us feel safe and secure. For most of us, we will, as we feel more and more threatened, we kind of reduce down and down and down to our immediate family and the people that we find closest to us and trust us most, and whom we trust most. If you think about evolutionary process, human beings have existed on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years maybe, but certainly hundreds of thousands of years. And for most of that time, for 96 or 98% of the time we've been around, it hasn't been modern life. The last 2,000 years have been a relatively small part of that. The dominant way that we have evolved to live is in kinship groups. In other words, groups that are made up of our families and our close friends. So, marrying in or marrying out, this idea of a very close and tight community. So there's research shows that our brains are capable of creating intimate relationships with between 15 and 20 people. And that beyond that, it just becomes a blur. Now, that is an evolutionary process for a reason. And within that, there is the sense that we can trust those who are close to us, and those outside are a threat. So this is not something where we're starting from as sort of rational beings, that we're starting from a position that we love everybody, everybody's the same. My starting point is to treat everybody equally, and then I will, form an opinions on top of that. My argument is that we're actually hardwired to feel threatened by difference. We are hardwired to be suspicious of a stranger, of aliens, of people who look differently to us. And we are hardwired to trust the people closest to us in our families, and to make a distinction between that trust and those who are outside. So that's one factor. Add in on top of that all the experiences that we've had, and I would argue that trauma is a component in most of our lives. So what trauma does for us is it internalizes fear. A traumatic incident is one that is not remembered, it is re-experienced. So people living with traumatic experiences of violence are constantly re-experiencing those negative experiences that they've had, which means that there's this kind of constant sense of anxiety and fear. And it's almost like people are frightened and they're waiting for something to turn up that they can be frightened of. And I don't mean to be facetious of this, but there's an old expression that in Northern Ireland, we'll travel a long way to be offended. And I think there's certain truth in this, that if we are a community that has been under threat or has felt ourselves to be persecuted, then it sort of hardwires within us as a community that sense of mistrust of outsiders. It's not hard for that to be translated then using the malign influence of government or malign actors in society, for that kind of openness to being threatened to be driven a particular direction in a way that is politically expedient. So the China virus thing is a perfect example of that. That was a politically expedient scapegoat. It was in the interests of those who were involved at the time to blame somebody. The fact that there's kind of hardwired suspicion within a particular element of the community of people who look differently, either whether that be people of Chinese origin, Asian origin, or the issues of sort of African Americans, it doesn't matter what the difference is. The message that comes through is that this difference is a sign of threat. And that once people make that equation, they start to say, they personalize it. So they start to say, this group is now a threat to my life. And the coronavirus example is a really profound one, because people began to say, you as a nation are a threat to my life and the lives of my family. You've brought this virus, we're going to die. Mm. And it doesn't take a genius to work out what the consequence of that becomes, because it becomes personal. And it starts with this predisposition that we have to feel threatened by difference, and to feel threatened by those who don't look like us, don't believe what we believe, don't speak the way we speak, etc., etc., etc.
Because I know here in Canada right now, just the Prime Minister just announced that they're going to issue an apology to the Italian community for the way in which they were treated when they were immigrants. And this is something that's repeated itself over and over again with each wave of people in the country, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a famous, the Irish are an interesting example of this, because, when I was thinking about moving over here to the States, my naive and rather, I think, probably simplistic assumption was everybody loves the Irish. We've been everywhere when we went to America, blah, 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 blah. Then I started reading about it, and there's a famous book by a guy called Ignatieff called, When the Irish Became White. And it tells the story of Irish racism, where the Irish were racist towards people. So the story is they came to America, were persecuted, blacks, and, the signs that used to be up, here's a job, but blacks and Irish need not apply. The Irish response to that was to say, all right, we know how to work this system. So they became, in themselves, they ended up becoming quite racist and getting involved in deeply racist activity against other minority groups that were coming in behind them. It was as if, having been the victim, they became perpetrators then as part of that history. And that's not, I'm not picking on the Irish. I think that phenomenon of, if I have been persecuted myself, or if my group has been persecuted, it's this theory about trauma. If I have been, then I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to me. So I'm going to be more suspicious. I'm going to act out more. And I think that, a lot of nations have an awful lot to apologize for in terms of allowing these things to happen and allowing various groups to be scapegoated. Scapegoating is a really important concept in this. Scapegoating is some people think of it as a religious term. In the religious understanding of it, it was all the consequences of sin, so all the bad stuff. And instead of God punishing the people, God punished the goat on behalf of the people. Now think of the parallel, that in society we scapegoat groups by locating all the bad stuff in those groups. These people are drug dealers, they're rapists, they're, the source of disease, they're this, that, or the other. They're all bad, so that we don't have to feel bad about ourselves. We don't have to take responsibility for the stuff that's going on for us, because all the badness is in them. And that's what scapegoating is. And I would argue that scapegoating is one of the dynamics of hate crime. It's one of the things that allows people a sense of moral justification. Why is it permissible for me to persecute this person? Well, it's because of all the bad stuff that they are representative of, or that they're bringing, or that they're contaminating. They're contaminating the purity of my community. Right. And it's one of the most sinister aspects of a lot of what's behind hate crime.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mentioned there about the signs. I saw something the other day which was about in England in the sort of 50s and 60s. It was not unusual to see apartments for rent, and the signs would be no blacks, no Irish.
Yeah.
And I remember vaguely as a kid when I think the Race Relations Act was brought in very early in the 60s, mid 60s, I think. And again, don't quote me on that. A number of news items as a small child where people were, we're not renting our place out to the Irish kind of thing. So, yeah. But I think it's interesting. It's this notion of scapegoating. Perhaps I think there's a current very good example. And we talked initially about anti-Asian hate, but what we're seeing with this notion of replacement theory, and I think we're seeing increasing anxiety around the southern border, and this idea that there's a plot, in fact, to dilute the current inhabitants, or certain group of current inhabitants of the US, with outsiders, in order to sort of capture and take away power from those who have it. And we've seen the Anti-Defamation League call for the resignation of Tucker Carlson. I mean, that's a great example of scapegoating, right?
It's absolutely spot on, and it feeds in. I mean, it's based on this principle that is so important in scapegoating, which is the fantasy of purity. It's this idea that there's this group of, and in that case you're describing, is that somehow the white population is pure, and should remain pure. So this idea of ethnic purity is, look at what Hitler tried to do in terms of describing what it meant to be German, or to be an Aryan person. It was this fantasy of genetic or ethnic purity. And that is one of the kind of precursors. It's one of the things that is a necessary precursor to anything like replacement therapy, where if on the basis of that idea, that sense of purity, then other people coming in are seen as diluting that purity. It is, of course, nonsense. There is no such thing as this sort of idea of a pure white race or whatever in the States or anywhere else, actually. At this stage in our evolution, most of us are a fairly interesting hybrid of a whole load of different ethnic backgrounds the further back that we go. But this fantasy gets created of ethnic purity. It's often driven by religious affiliation. It's this idea of homogeneity, that we are from the same place, that we are all the same, and that these outsiders are going to contaminate that. This idea of contamination. I mean, it is a very pernicious ideology that is being pushed. It's a conspiracy theory. and should be treated with the contempt that most conspiracy theories should be treated with, except that there is something behind it. And there's a dangerously sinister set of assumptions behind it about purity on the one hand, impurity on the other, and all of the consequences of being able to define the world in these sort of black and white terms. We're good, we're pure, and the rest of you out there are somehow imperfect and are going to dilute the goodness that we have around us.
Yeah, and it seems to me that this sort of othering process. I mean, language plays a big part. The sort of labels that we put on people, and in the case of the current discussion, this raising the issue of replacement theory, that you can see that the way in which the language is going to work in favour of that hate. But on the other hand, we live in a society that holds sort of sacrosanct the notion that you can say whatever you want. I mean, how do we resolve that? Right.
I think it's incredibly different. It's one of the I live in New Hampshire, and I often laugh about this. And the motto of New Hampshire is "Live free or die." And I look at that and I think I understand why some people would hear that as a really bold statement of independence. But what that translates into is, if I don't want to wear a seatbelt, I don't have to. If I don't want to wear a crash helmet on a motorcycle, I don't have to. If I want to kill myself and other people through behaviors like that, I'm absolutely free to do it, which is, in my mind, a really weird understanding of what freedom is. And this idea of freedom of speech is kind of understood in the same absolutist sort of way. Freedom of speech means I can say whatever I want to say in any given circumstance. And that is simply not true. That is not helpful in society, and it is irresponsible to present freedom of speech or even the live free or die idea in that way. And what it pushes is this idea of a lack of personal responsibility for the consequences of our thoughts, words, or actions. And I mean, I take it back to the point that I made at the start. I don't think we start this with a clean sheet. When I was at school, when I was at primary school, in the playground, people bullied one another. I wore glasses when I was a kid. I remember clearly getting glasses when I was in primary 2, which is when I would have been 6 or 7. And my mum used to tell the story that we went, picked up the glasses, and I would sitting in the back of the car on the way home going, "Oh, what's that? What's that?" Because I realized that for 6 years of my life, I hadn't been able to see. Kids started picking on me in school because I wore glasses, called me Specky Four Eyes or Joe 90 or whatever, because I was a bit different. Now, it hasn't caused me eternal damage, but the point I'm making is, it is natural to do that. That is not a alien concept to any of us. So what we need to learn is, why is that a bad thing? Children and the rest of us need to work on the premise that our initial starting point is probably that we're a bit frightened by difference. And we need to learn from an early age, actually, that difference is good, that diversity is good, that actually it is possible to embrace these things rather than to be frightened by them. But my point is, we need to learn that. It does not come naturally to us. Our natural position is one of being frightened and defensive, I think, beyond the kind of intimate connections that we have in our family. And therefore, we need to think about what that looks like at a whole society level, but also for our education system, for example. Because I think that this is about, there is a lot in this which is about assuming that people, in the absence of any other intervention, are going to start off by othering and being frightened of the other and being uncomfortable with difference. That's the starting point. It's not the other way around. It's not that actually underneath it all, we're really comfortable with this and they're just a few, errant people who have gone too far. Yeah. It's the other way around. We need to work on the basis that there's a fundamental sense of threat, and therefore we need to educate and support and give examples to people of how better to engage with diversity.
Yeah, and I have to say, I don't think at this moment I could put my hand on my heart and swear that I never, as a kid, called another kid Four Eyes. I think that's probably interesting. I was having a conversation the other day with my eldest daughter, who's 32. I should know her. Yeah, she's 32. I know how old my daughter is, and she has this wonderful head of beautiful red hair. I mean, she's fantastic. And she was telling me about how she was bullied at school, and even quite recently has been bullied for her red hair. And I never knew. I mean, it's just the things people will pick on. Is quite surprising. So perhaps we should I'm going to do two things before we close. One is return to the question of Northern Ireland, because you mentioned earlier on about the Good Friday peace agreement that sort of resolved part of the problem. But clearly, what we're seeing now is, an increasing, there's been rioting recently on the streets in Belfast, that a lot of the underlying issues never got resolved. What's the lesson from what's happening in Northern Ireland now?
So I think what's happening in Northern, people are throwing their hands up about what's happening in Northern Ireland at the minute. What's happening in Northern Ireland has been entirely predictable. I've been talking about it for years. And it's predictable because the underlying conflict in Northern Ireland has never been able to be addressed. The Good Friday Agreement is a wonderful agreement. It was a remarkable process and a remarkable product, but it set the scene for then 20 years of work that should have happened and that we have really struggled to engage with, which is about how do we deal with fundamental difference? How do we deal with the legacy of the conflict, the trauma and traumatized communities? How do we deal with social inequities that are a consequence of that? And in the absence of dealing with those things, what we are left with is, in the example of the situation we find ourselves in now, a Protestant loyalist community that feels that it has been sold down the river, that that the only solution to that is violence because that's what we all grew up with and that's what we know. And I think that in real terms, the existential crisis that has faced the loyalist community, who are the source of the conflict at the moment, that has been bubbling around for a long time. Whenever Brexit came along, it was fairly clear at that point, in my view anyway, that the only way that the British government could resolve the issues around border control was to have a border in the Irish Sea rather than to deal with the only European land border, which was in North and South Ireland. So, and that's exactly what has happened. You have a situation where that land border is now fudged, and effectively in terms of trade, you have the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is that trade between the North and between Ireland and the UK and Great Britain is across the Irish Sea. Of course, Unionists and Loyalists feel as if that is undermining their place in the UK because there's no other part of the UK where their border is dealt with like that. And in Northern Ireland, that is more than just a bit of discomfort. It means that they have the sense that this is a signal of a threat to the Union. And I actually think they are absolutely right. So I don't think that what they're doing is right, but I think their analysis is right. And I think therein lies the problem because there's a game that is played in this by politicians, which is, don't worry, everything will be fine. Sure, it's just words. This just is a form of words. Da-da-da-da-da. We learned the lesson over many years and many hardships and many deaths that words matter. Words kill people. And it is important to get this stuff sorted out. In I'll finish by saying this, John. In Northern Ireland, there's also a deep undercurrent and underbody of unresolved trauma at a community level. So I'm not necessarily talking about people walking around with post-traumatic stress disorder, but I am talking about whole communities whose behavior is informed by their experience of atrocity and murder in the past. And the trauma of that has affected their willingness to engage with difference, which is, what we've been talking about for the last half hour. So there's something about that intransigence, that unwillingness, that lack of capacity, actually, or resilience to engage with change and difference means that they are vulnerable when a change is imposed upon them, which is exactly what Brexit has felt like. Northern Ireland did not vote to leave the European Union. The UK did, Northern Ireland did not. And it feels like this decision that has had such a profound impact on the identity of Unionists in Northern Ireland has been taken out of their hands. No control over it, and no sense of really accountability for it. So I think this is a dangerous time. I think it's a dangerous time globally, if you want my opinion about that. But I think in my home, Northern Ireland, it is a very particularly dangerous time.
Yes, I wouldn't. I wouldn't argue with that. And as someone who experience. I mean, I had friends who worked at Harrods when the Harrods bombing took place, and other things. So, but I mean, my relationship with what was going on in Northern Ireland was very distant, really, living in England. But it breaks my heart to see what's going on there now. Just sort of close. I mean, we described a situation of sort of, a genetic predisposition towards fear and suspicion. communities with long histories of attempting to resolve issues with violence, in not a terribly sort of optimistic view of things. The one thing I would you mentioned about education and stuff, and I know I see in my own children who were raised from a very young age here in Canada. I think just because of the environment of the diversity of the people that they got to know as growing up as kids has made them a lot more comfortable, I think, than I certainly was growing up. What can we do, Peter? You know, as individuals and as a society to kind of get ahead of this thing? I mean, is there something you can suggest?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think there's a silver bullet, and it's a complex problem that has a complex solution. But there are a number of things that I think are incredibly important. One is an experience that we had in Northern Ireland, which was a legal position that was taken, which was to make it illegal to discriminate in Northern Ireland against anybody for a job. In Northern Ireland, when I was growing up, if you were a Protestant, for example, you were almost guaranteed a job in certain areas. And if you're a Catholic, there was not a snowball's hope in hell that you could get a job in those organizations. Or I can honestly say that with the introduction of a legal framework that was robustly applied, I am absolutely confident that there is little, if not no, discrimination on the basis of, religion, gender, sexual identity, or whatever in Northern Ireland in the workplace. There's lots of it elsewhere, but in the workplace. So my point is that there is a component to this which is legal, to afford legal protections to people, to create a statutory framework that allows people's rights to be properly protected in law, and where that is robustly prosecuted. Is incredibly important. The second thing I would say is about education. In Northern Ireland, one of the problems that we have, and what has perpetuated the underlying divisions that exist in our society, is that to this day, education remains sectarian, divided. There has been a shift in terms of a combined or integrated education movement, but by far the biggest majority of children will grow up in one community or another as being educated in religion-specific schools or community-specific schools. And I think your children's experience is the experience of many children who grow up in a more diverse environment, which is they learn early on that diversity is good, that difference is normal, and that in learning that they're not frightened by it. Children who have never encountered someone who have a different skin color to them. And when I remember one of the first times I was in Africa, traveling out into the bush and visiting villages where, in some villages, children would run because they wanted something. They would come and they'd want to touch me and touch my skin, this white skin that they'd not seen. Other children were terrified; they'd never seen a white person before, and the difference was terrifying to them. So there's something about exposure that allows people to be taught, to be actively, directly taught that difference is good, that diversity is good, that this enriches society, it enriches a culture, that these are good things. And then the last thing, I suppose, is so I'm thinking about the legal framework, I'm thinking about children and education. I think for adults, there's something about where do we learn our lessons? Who are the role models for us? In a society like America, where America not only tolerated but elected a person who was, I believe, racist and who gave out a message which was not inclusive and was anti so many components of society, I think is a terribly sad indictment of the decisions that we make as adults about the role models that we have and the people that we want to represent us. I think the work that's going on at the minute on diversity, equality, and inclusion needs to be really mainstreamed. It needs to become not just simply about race, which I think is incredibly political and is important, and it's very necessary for it to be involved in that, but it needs to go way beyond that into dealing with issues of genuine diversity and difference. And we need to find ways of creating commonality. So, I do not know what it feels like to be a Black person growing up in America. So I can't say that I understand that. But I have a connection because I know what it feels like to be a foreigner. I know what it feels like to live here, and that's not the same, and it's not equivalent, and it's not in any way the same category. But it's at least a starting point of connection that might make for an interesting conversation about our skin is different color, our experiences are different, but is there something underneath this where we can both say, yeah, I have experienced the same thing as you? Because once we get that point of connection, that's where you start to build trust. And it's on the basis of trust then we start to be able to embrace and understand difference. But it's a long journey. And it is, I think my point at the start is we have to kind of overcome our fear before we're able to start on it.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for an interesting conversation today and giving us, I think, some genuine and original insight into the notion of hate crime. Clearly a topic that requires more than the 40 minutes we've taken today to get a handle around. But I've certainly learnt a lot, as I always do when we talk, Peter. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure, John. I really enjoy it too. Thank you very much for asking me.
Thanks. And thank you for listening. This has been DEI-logue. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you sign up for the Diversity and Inclusion, our virtual conference happening on May 24th to 26th. Peter will be one of our speakers. We have about 25 or 30 really great people who are sharing their perspectives on various aspects of diversity, equity and inclusion. Thank you all.